The kennel door rattled as the shepherd lunged again, teeth bared, eyes wild with something beyond rage. The handler jerked back, swearing, "That's the third volunteer this month. Nobody can touch him." I stood there, 62 years old, watching those eyes, not seeing a violent dog, but a soldier who never made it home. The foam at his muzzle, the way his body coiled tight as a spring, the constant scanning for threats that weren't there anymore. I knew that look. I'd seen it in mirrors for decades. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. My workshop sits behind my house in Augusta, Georgia, where I restore old furniture for folks who still believe things are worth fixing. The wood shavings smell like cedar and oak, and sometimes, when the wind comes through just right, I can almost forget the other smells, the ones that never really leave you. I'm Marcus Webb, retired Army, and most days I can keep the past where it belongs. Most days. But when Linda from the VA called asking if I'd consider adopting a military working dog that nobody else could handle, something in her voice told me this wasn't about the dog needing me. Maybe it was about me needing to remember that broken things can still have purpose. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was sanding down a walnut dresser, hands moving in the rhythm I'd learned from my grandfather. He'd been a carpenter in Selma, taught me that good work requires patience, that you can't rush the grain. The phone rang 3 times before I answered, and Linda's voice carried that careful tone people use when they're about to ask for something they're not sure you'll give. "Marcus, we have a situation." That's how it started. A German shepherd named Titan, 8 years old, 3 deployments in Afghanistan, retired with honors and now sitting in a military kennel in South Carolina because every potential adopter had walked away. "Some dogs come home different," she said. "Some dogs come home the way some of us did." I drove up to Fort Jackson on a Friday, the highway stretching through pine forests that could have been anywhere, could have been nowhere. My truck's old but reliable like me, and I'd loaded the bed with blankets and a crate I'd built myself from pine and steel mesh. Didn't know if I'd need it, but 30 years in the Army taught me to prepare for missions even when you don't know what you're walking into. The kennel facility sat behind the main base, a series of concrete buildings that looked more like a prison than a place for heroes. The sound hit me first. Barking, howling, the chaos of confined animals. Then the smell. Disinfectant trying to cover what it couldn't quite hide. The handler who met me was young, maybe 25, with corporal stripes, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from dealing with problems nobody trained you for. His name was Phillips, and he had scratches on his forearms, fresh ones. "You're the guy from Augusta," he said, not quite a question. "Linda said you might be able to help, but I gotta be honest, sir. This dog's been flagged for behavioral euthanasia. He's hurt 4 handlers in the past month. We've tried everything: medication, behavioral specialists, isolation, socialization. Nothing works. He just gets worse." I followed him deeper into the facility, past kennels where other dogs watched us with calmer eyes, until we reached the last row where one cage sat separated from the others. Titan's kennel was double reinforced, the kind they use for maximum security cases. The shepherd inside wasn't pacing. He was patrolling, methodical, trained, every movement purposeful even in his madness. His coat was darker than most shepherds I'd seen, almost black across the shoulders, with the traditional tan markings on his legs and face. But it was his eyes that stopped me. They weren't the eyes of a vicious animal. They were the eyes of someone still on patrol in a place where the war never ended. Philip stayed back, hand on his radio like he might need backup. "He was IED detection," Philip said quietly. "Saved his unit 4 times, lost his handler in Kandahar during his last deployment. Been like this ever since." I moved closer to the kennel, slowly, and Titan's attention locked on me like a laser sight. His lips curled back, showing teeth designed to end threats. The growl that came from his chest was low and steady, a warning that didn't need translation. But underneath the aggression, I saw something else. The way his ears kept swiveling, catching sounds from every direction. The slight tremor in his haunches, the white showing at the edges of his eyes. This wasn't rage. This was fear dressed up in armor because being vulnerable meant being dead. "How long has he been in isolation?" I asked. Phillips checked his tablet. 63 days. We had to pull him from the general population. He went after a handler who approached his food bowl too quickly. I knelt down, not directly in front of the kennel but to the side, making myself smaller, less threatening. Basic stuff, but most people forget basics when they're scared. Titan's growl intensified, his body coiling tighter. Phillips took a step back. "Sir, I really don't think—" But I wasn't listening to Phillips anymore. I was watching Titan, watching the way his muscles bunched under his coat, watching the whites of his eyes, watching for the thing I knew was there because I'd carried it myself for so long. "You've seen war too, haven't you?" I said, quiet enough that Phillips probably couldn't hear. Titan's growl stuttered just for a second, and his ears flicked forward before pinning back again. The memory hit me like it always did, sudden, complete, dragging me under before I could brace for it. Helmand Province, 2011, the last deployment before they finally let me retire. I was 50 years old, too old to be kicking down doors, but the Army needed experienced NCOs, and I'd never learned how to say no to the mission. Our unit was working with local Afghan forces, training them, supposedly preparing them to take over security. But training doesn't mean much when the Taliban sees you as an invader, and your own allies might turn their weapons on you at any moment. Sleep came in 2-hour increments, if it came at all. You learn to sleep with your rifle in your hands, with your boots still tied, with one part of your brain always scanning for the sound that meant incoming. My squad leader back then was a kid from Tennessee named Morrison, blonde hair and a Tennessee Titans tattoo on his forearm. He'd call me Pops and make jokes about me being old enough to remember Vietnam, even though I'd only been a kid when that war ended. But Morrison had also grown up in a town where the Confederate flag still flew outside the courthouse, and sometimes his jokes had edges I couldn't quite laugh at. "Hey, Pops, you sure you're up for this patrol? Maybe you should stay back, guard the coffee pot." The other guys would laugh, that nervous laughter soldiers use when they don't know if something's a joke or a problem, and I'd just nod, check my rifle again, and wait for the mission brief. The patrol that changed everything happened on a Thursday, though days of the week stopped meaning much after your third month in country. Morrison assigned me to rear security, which meant walking backwards half the time, covering our six while the squad moved through a village that intelligence said was friendly. Intelligence was wrong about a lot of things. The IED hit the lead vehicle, a massive explosion that turned a Humvee into shrapnel and flame. Morrison was inside. By the time the smoke cleared enough to see, there was nothing left to save. The Taliban opened up from 3 directions, and suddenly rear security became the only position that mattered, because I was the only one who'd been watching the direction they came from. I put down 4 insurgents before the rest scattered, gave the squad time to establish a perimeter, called in the medevac that came too late for Morrison. When the after-action review happened, the captain commended my awareness and response time. The other guys in the squad stopped calling me Pops, but I kept thinking about Morrison's jokes, about the way he'd looked at me sometimes like I was there to fill a quota, about how he'd died before either of us figured out if he'd really seen me as a soldier or just as a black soldier, and I thought about how I'd saved the rest of that squad even though Morrison never quite trusted me to lead, even though I'd spent 30 years proving myself over and over in a uniform that was supposed to make us all the same color, green. Titan was still watching me, but the growling had stopped. His body remained tense, ready to explode into violence, but his eyes had changed, not softened exactly, but shifted into something more aware, more present. Phillips cleared his throat behind me. "Sir, protocol says I need to maintain a safe distance between I held up my hand, kept my eyes on Titan. "How many explosions did he work?" I asked. Phillips consulted his tablet again. Records show he alerted on 47 IEDs across 3 deployments, saved estimated 200 lives. 47 times this dog had found death hidden in the ground and pulled his handler back from the edge. 47 times he'd done his job perfectly. And his reward was isolation in a concrete box, because nobody knew how to help him stop doing that job. The afternoon sun angled through the high windows of the kennel, cutting bars of light across Titan's cage. I watched the dust motes drift through those bars like they had all the time in the world, like they hadn't learned yet that stillness is dangerous. Titan tracked them too, his focus absolute, and I recognized that hypervigilance, that need to identify and categorize every stimulus, because the one you miss is the one that kills you. The kennel smelled like disinfectant and fear sweat, and the particular staleness of air that doesn't circulate enough. I'd spent enough time in confined spaces to know that smell, to know how it gets inside you and stays there long after you're free. "Tell me about the handler he lost," I said. Phillips pulled up another file, his face going carefully neutral the way soldiers do when the story's bad. "Staff Sergeant David Chen, 28 years old, second deployment with Titan. They were clearing a compound in Kandahar when an insurgent got past the perimeter. Chen put himself between the insurgent and his squad. Titan took down the insurgent, but Chen died from his wounds before the medevac arrived. Titan stayed with the body for 6 hours, wouldn't let anyone approach. They had to tranquilize him to extract them both." The words were clinical, professional, but I heard what Phillips wasn't saying. Titan had done everything right and lost his partner anyway. That's the thing about war. You can be perfect and still lose everything. I stood slowly, keeping my movements predictable, and Titan's eyes tracked me, but he didn't lunge. Phillips looked relieved that I was backing away, but I wasn't leaving. I was just giving Titan space to decide what happened next. "I need to be alone with him," I said. Phillips's eyes went wide. "Sir, that violates every safety protocol we have. I can't authorize—" I turned to look at him, and whatever he saw in my face made him stop talking. "Son, I spent 30 years in the Army. I know the protocols. I also know that sometimes the protocols are what keep the healing from happening. You can stay by the door if it makes you feel better, but I need the space quiet. No radio chatter, no interruptions. Can you do that?" Phillips hesitated, clearly running through the disciplinary consequences of letting a civilian get mauled by a military dog, but finally he nodded and moved back to the door, hand still on his radio but silent. I turned back to Titan. The dog had sat down, which was something, less aggressive posture, though his muscles still bunched under his coat like loaded springs. I sat down too, cross-legged on the concrete floor about 6 feet from the kennel, close enough that Titan could see me clearly but far enough that my presence wasn't a direct challenge. The floor was cold and hard, and my knees immediately reminded me that I was 62, not 22, but I ignored them. This wasn't about comfort. This was about time. For 5 minutes, neither of us moved. Titan watched me with absolute focus, ears forward now instead of pinned back, his breathing steady but alert. I just sat there, hands loose in my lap, letting him look at me, letting him see that I wasn't trying to take anything from him or give him commands he couldn't follow. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant sounds of other dogs and the hum of ventilation systems. It was the kind of silence that makes most people uncomfortable, that makes them want to fill it with words or movement. But I'd learned long ago to trust silence. Silence is where the truth lives when you're brave enough to sit with it. "My name is Marcus," I said finally, voice low and even. "I was in the Army for 30 years. Did 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in the Gulf before that. I know what it's like when the war doesn't end just because they put you on a plane home." Titan's ears twitched, tracking my voice. I know what it's like when everyone expects you to be fine because you're not bleeding anymore, even though the wounds you can't see are the ones that hurt worst. I know what it's like to lose people you were supposed to protect, to have that failure burn in your chest every single day, like an ember that won't go cold. Titan shifted, not standing but adjusting his position, and for the first time since I'd arrived, he broke eye contact. Not in submission exactly, but in something that looked like recognition. His gaze drifted to the side, to the empty space where a handler should have been, and I saw the loss there as clear as if he'd spoken it. "You're not broken," I said. "You're doing exactly what you were trained to do. You're staying alert, staying ready, because the last time you let your guard down, the last time you trusted the world to be safe, you lost everything. That's not crazy. That's survival. But brother, you're not in Kandahar anymore, and survival isn't the same as living." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt the weight of them in my own chest, felt the truth of them settle into places I usually kept locked down. Because I was talking to Titan, but I was also talking to myself, to the part of me that still scanned every room for exits, that woke up at 0300 with my heart hammering and my hand reaching for a rifle that wasn't there anymore. The part of me that had spent 3 years after retirement barely leaving my house, because crowds felt like ambush zones and sudden noises sent me diving for cover that didn't exist. The part of me that Linda from the VA had finally reached when she'd called to say that sometimes helping something broken is how you fix yourself. Phillips shifted by the door, and I heard him whisper into his radio, probably updating his supervisor that the old black man was sitting on the floor talking to a violent dog, and so far nobody had died. The thought almost made me smile. People saw an old man, a retired soldier, someone past his usefulness. They didn't see the sniper qualification badge I'd earned at 45 when most guys were content to coast to retirement. They didn't see the 3 deployment medals, the Bronze Star with Valor device that sat in a drawer at home because displaying it felt like showing off. They didn't see the 30 years of proving that I belonged in every unit, every mission, every leadership position I'd earned while carrying the weight of representing every black soldier who came before me and everyone who'd come after. Titan stood suddenly, and Phillips's hand went to his radio, but the dog didn't lunge. He moved to the corner of his kennel where a worn military blanket lay bunched up, and he pawed at it twice before circling and lying down, his body still tense but his eyes never leaving mine. It was the most relaxed I'd seen him since I arrived, and I recognized the gesture. A tiny surrender, a small admission that maybe, possibly, the immediate threat level had decreased from critical to merely elevated. "That's good," I said quietly. "That's a start. Nobody's asking you to trust me yet. Trust takes time. But maybe you can sit with me while we both figure out what comes next." The deployment that broke me, really broke me under the scars, and the training, and the professional competence I'd built like armor, happened in Fallujah, 2006. I was 43 years old, Master Sergeant, running a platoon of kids who barely looked old enough to shave. We were doing house-to-house searches, looking for insurgents, weapons caches, anything that might keep our sector from exploding. The houses all looked the same after a while. Concrete walls, metal doors, families who looked at us with either fear or hatred, or that exhausted blankness that meant they'd stopped hoping for normal life to return. We'd done maybe 100 searches by then. This one should have been routine. The family had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all under 10 years old. The father stood with his hands up, trying to explain something in broken English while our interpreter translated. No weapons, no insurgents, just a family trying to survive. My platoon leader was a lieutenant named Garrett, fresh from West Point, eager to prove himself, and when one of the kids, the little girl, ran toward her father crying, Garrett drew his sidearm. "Stop! Stop right now!" he shouted, and the fear in his voice was naked and real, because scared soldiers make fatal mistakes. I moved without thinking, stepped between Garrett and the child, hand on his weapon, pushing it toward the ground. "Stand down, Lieutenant. She's a child. She's terrified. Lower your weapon." Garrett's face went red, embarrassment and anger mixing into something dangerous. The child clung to her father, sobbing, and the father's eyes met mine, grateful, terrified, fully aware how close his daughter had come to dying. After we cleared the house and moved on, Garrett pulled me aside. His voice was low but sharp enough to cut. "Don't you ever countermand my orders in front of the men again, Sergeant? I don't care how long you've been in. I'm the officer here. You undermined my authority." I stood at attention, jaw tight, choosing my words carefully because what I wanted to say would have ended my career. "Sir, with respect, that child wasn't a threat. Drawing your weapon escalated the situation unnecessarily." "You don't get to make that call," Garrett snapped. "And maybe where you come from, questioning authority is acceptable. But in my army we follow the chain of command." The words hung there. "Where you come from." And we both knew he wasn't talking about Georgia or my military record. He was talking about the color of my skin, about the assumptions he'd carried from West Point or his hometown, or wherever men learn that some soldiers are real soldiers and some are diversity checkboxes. I said nothing, because 30 years had taught me that sometimes saying nothing is the only way to survive with your dignity intact, even when your soul wants to scream. I saluted, sharp and proper, and returned to my squad. But something had changed. Some line had been crossed that I couldn't uncross. Titan watched me from his blanket, his eyes tracking the memories playing across my face. I wondered what he saw. An old man lost in his head, or a fellow veteran still fighting battles that ended years ago. "You know what the worst part was?" I said to him, my voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't Garrett's prejudice. I'd dealt with that my whole career, from drill sergeants who worked me twice as hard to prove I didn't belong, to fellow NCOs who assumed I'd gotten my rank through affirmative action rather than competence. The worst part was knowing that if I'd let him shoot that child, if I'd followed orders and done nothing, he would have called it combat stress, just another casualty. One more name that nobody back home would remember." The sun had shifted, and the bars of light across Titan's cage had moved with it, marking time in the way sunlight does when you're trapped somewhere you can't leave. I thought about all the cages I'd been in, literal ones during SEER training, metaphorical ones made of rank structure and unspoken rules about how far a black soldier could rise before the system started pushing back. I thought about the cages I'd built myself, the walls I'd put up to protect the soft parts that military life hadn't managed to harden completely. And I thought about how Titan's cage was maybe more honest than mine had ever been, because at least his had bars you could see. "The thing about cages," I said, "is that sometimes we need them. When everything's chaos, when the world's too big and too dangerous, a cage can feel like safety. But there comes a point where the cage that kept you alive starts killing you in slower ways. And the hardest part is knowing when it's time to open the door, even when everything in you says that outside is where the danger lives." Titan's ears flicked forward, and I could see him processing my words. Not the meaning, maybe, but the tone, the intention behind them. Dogs are good at that, better than people sometimes. They hear what you're actually saying under the words you choose. Phillips checked his watch, clearly calculating how much longer he could let this unauthorized interaction continue before someone higher up asked questions. But he didn't interrupt, and I was grateful for that. Some moments need time to unfold in their own rhythm, can't be rushed or forced or scheduled into neat blocks of regulated interaction. Titan and I were having a conversation that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with recognition, the kind that happens when two beings who've both been broken by the same machine find each other in the wreckage and realize they're not as alone as they thought. I reached slowly into my jacket pocket, and Titan's body tensed, ready to explode into defense, but I kept my movements smooth and predictable. I pulled out a photograph, creased and faded from years in my wallet, and held it so Titan could see even though I knew he couldn't parse what the image meant. It showed a younger version of me, 30 years younger, in desert camouflage with a rifle and a 1,000-yard stare, standing next to a military working dog. A Belgian Malinois named Rex, who'd been our unit's explosives detection dog in Desert Storm. "This was Rex," I said. "He saved my life in Kuwait when I was too young to know how close I was to dying." Rex had been crazy too in his own way, obsessive about his job, unable to relax even in the safest environments, constantly scanning for threats that might or might not exist. His handler, a guy named Torres from New Mexico, used to joke that Rex had forgotten how to be a dog, that the army had trained the animal right out of him and left only the soldier behind. But Torres said it with affection, with the kind of love that soldiers develop for the creatures who stand between them and death. When Torres rotated home, Rex stayed for another deployment with a new handler, and I'd heard through the grapevine that Rex had eventually been retired stateside, adopted by Torres's family, and lived to be 13 years old for a working dog, almost unheard of for one with Rex's intensity. "Rex taught me something important," I told Titan. "He taught me that intensity isn't the same as aggression, that being alert isn't the same as being violent, and that sometimes what looks like crazy is just someone doing their job so well they forget how to stop." Titan's tail moved, just once, a tiny thump against the concrete floor that might have been involuntary, or might have been the first sign that something was shifting in the space between us. I didn't react, didn't make a big deal of it, just let it be what it was. A small moment in a larger conversation that would take more than one afternoon to finish. The decision to take Titan home wasn't really a decision at all. It was more like a recognition of something that had already happened the moment I'd walked into that kennel and seen my own reflection in his eyes. Phillips made me sign approximately 17,000 forms releasing the Army from liability if Titan decided to maul me, and arranged for a behavioral specialist to do a home visit within the first week. They gave me medications, anti-anxiety drugs that might help Titan adjust, and a 3-inch binder full of protocols for managing aggressive behavior. I thanked them, took the binder, and knew I probably wouldn't open it. Protocols and medications had their place, but what Titan needed wasn't something you could find in a manual. Loading him into my truck took 45 minutes and the help of 3 handlers, but eventually we got him settled in the reinforced crate I'd built, secured in the truck bed with straps that could have held down a small tank. Titan's eyes never left me during the drive home, tracking me through the mesh sides of the crate, his body tense but not panicked. I talked to him the whole way, keeping my voice low and steady, telling him about Augusta and my workshop and the 3 acres I'd bought specifically because they were far enough from neighbors that nobody would complain about noise or question why I sometimes spent entire days alone in the woods behind my house. My property sat at the end of a dirt road that most GPS systems couldn't find, surrounded by Georgia pine and oak, with a small creek running through the back corner where the land dipped into a natural hollow. The house was nothing special. Single-story, wood siding that needed paint, a porch that sagged slightly on one end. But it was mine, paid off after 30 years of military salary, carefully saved and invested. The workshop was separate. A pole barn I'd built myself, insulated and wired for power, filled with the tools and projects that kept my hands busy and my mind focused on something other than the past. I pulled the truck up next to the workshop and cut the engine, letting the silence settle before I approached Titan's crate. "Welcome home," I said, though I knew that word probably didn't mean anything to him anymore. Home was a concept that required trust, required the belief that you could let your guard down and survive the vulnerability. For Titan, home had been wherever Chen was, and Chen was gone, and everything since had just been waiting for the next deployment, the next mission, the next purpose that never came. I opened the crate door slowly, giving him the choice to come out or stay put, and for a long moment he just sat there, staring at the opening like it might be a trap. Then, carefully, he stepped down onto Georgia soil and immediately went into alert mode, scanning the property with absolute focus, cataloging every tree, every shadow, every potential threat. The first 3 days were the hardest. Titan wouldn't eat unless I was out of sight, wouldn't sleep except in 2-hour increments, and spent most of his time pacing the perimeter of the fenced area I'd prepared for him, a quarter-acre enclosed by 8-foot chain link that I'd installed years ago thinking maybe I'd get a dog someday. He reminded me of myself after Fallujah, after I'd come home to a world that expected me to be fine because I hadn't lost any limbs, hadn't come back in a flag-draped coffin. People don't know what to do with invisible wounds, with damage that doesn't show up in x-rays or blood work. They want healing to be linear, predictable, measurable. They want you to follow the protocol and get better on schedule. But healing isn't linear. It's messy and complicated and full of setbacks that look like failure until you realize they're just part of the process. On the 4th day, I found Titan lying in the corner of his enclosure, not pacing for the first time since he'd arrived. I didn't approach, didn't make it a moment, just kept working on the dresser I was refinishing, sanding the wood with steady strokes, while Titan watched me from 30 feet away. The rhythm of work is its own kind of meditation, my grandfather used to say. Your hands move, your mind settles, and the noise inside gets quieter. I'd learned he was right during the years after retirement when the noise inside threatened to drown out everything else. On the 7th day, Titan ate while I sat on the porch. On the 10th day, he didn't pace. On the 14th day, he let me enter his enclosure without lunging, though his body stayed tense and ready. On the 21st day, 3 weeks exactly, I sat down in his space and he didn't move away. We just existed in the same area, breathing the same air, both of us slowly learning that proximity didn't have to mean danger. The VA behavioral specialist came for her home visit and spent 2 hours observing, making notes on her tablet, clearly expecting to document a disaster. Instead, she watched Titan track me around the property, not with aggression but with attention, the way a soldier watches his squad leader. "This is remarkable progress," she said finally. "Most dogs with his history never adjust to civilian life." "That's because most people try to train the soldier out of them," I said. "But Titan doesn't need to stop being a soldier. He just needs to learn that the war is over." She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to decide if that was wisdom or delusion. Maybe it was both. Maybe all wisdom is just delusion that worked out. She updated her paperwork, cleared me for continued solo management, and told me to call if things deteriorated. I thanked her and knew I wouldn't call. Whatever happened between me and Titan, we'd figure it out ourselves, the way veterans do when the official channels don't have answers that fit the actual questions. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday afternoon in late spring when a thunderstorm rolled through Augusta with the kind of violence that Georgia weather sometimes delivers. The sky went dark at 3 o'clock, and the rain came down in sheets while thunder cracked overhead like artillery. I was in the workshop when I heard Titan howling. Not barking, howling, the sound of an animal in absolute distress. I ran through the rain to his enclosure and found him pressed into the corner, body shaking, eyes wild. The thunder hit again, and he lunged at the fence, trying to escape, trying to get away from the sound that his brain couldn't separate from mortar fire or IED explosions. I didn't think. I opened the gate and went in, getting soaked by rain, and sat down in the mud about 10 feet from where Titan was pressed against the fence. Another boom of thunder, and he lunged toward me, teeth bared, but stopped 3 feet away, caught between the instinct to attack and the memory that I'd never hurt him. "I know," I said, rain running down my face. "I know it sounds like incoming. I know your brain is screaming at you to find cover, to return fire, to do something. But it's just weather, brother. It's just noise. It can't hurt you anymore." My voice was steady, even though my own heart was hammering, even though the thunder was triggering my own memories of nights in Iraq when the mortars came in, and all you could do was press yourself flat and pray your number wasn't up. Titan took a step toward me, then another, his body still shaking, but his eyes locked on mine. Another crack of thunder, and he lunged the final distance, but instead of attacking, he pressed himself against my side, his whole body trembling against mine. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him the way you hold a brother in a foxhole when the world is exploding around you, and we sat there in the mud and the rain while the storm raged and slowly, gradually, passed. His breathing eventually synced with mine, his shaking subsided, and when the rain finally stopped and the sun broke through the clouds, we were both still there, both still alive, both a little less alone than we'd been before. After that day, something changed. Titan started following me when I worked, staying close but not crowding, his presence a constant weight at the edge of my awareness. He learned the rhythm of my days: coffee at sunrise, woodworking until noon, lunch on the porch, more work until evening, dinner as the sun went down. He learned that the UPS truck came on Tuesdays and Thursdays and wasn't a threat. He learned that the neighbor's tractor made noise every weekend but wasn't incoming. He learned that not every shadow hid an enemy, that not every stranger meant danger, that the world could be navigated with something less than constant vigilance. He was learning to live again, and by teaching him, I was learning too. The VA referred a young veteran to me about 6 months after I'd adopted Titan. His name was James, 24 years old, Marines, back from Afghanistan for 8 months, and struggling with reintegration. He'd heard through the veteran network that an old Army guy in Augusta had adopted a violent military dog and somehow made it work. He wanted to know how. I invited him over on a Saturday, and he showed up in a truck that was too clean, wearing clothes that were too neat, everything about him screaming the control mechanisms people use when they're barely holding it together. Titan watched him from the porch, alert, but not aggressive, and James stopped 20 feet away, uncertain. "He won't hurt you unless you give him a reason," I said. James nodded but didn't move closer. "I heard he put 4 handlers in the hospital." "He was doing his job," I said. "Problem was, nobody told him the job was over." James processed that, and I saw recognition flash across his face. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Nobody told me either." Lie. We spent that afternoon working on a bookshelf James wanted to build for his apartment, and Titan lay in the workshop doorway, watching both of us, his presence somehow making the silence between veterans easier to navigate. James came back the next weekend, and the one after that, and gradually I watched him learn the same lessons Titan had learned: that you could set down your rifle without dying, that peace wasn't weakness, that survival and living weren't the same thing. The memory of Morrison came back to me during one of those sessions with James. We were cutting wood for the bookshelf, and James mentioned his squad leader in Afghanistan, a guy named Torres who'd been killed by a sniper while they were on patrol. "He used to make jokes," James said, his hands shaking slightly as he measured the board, "about me being from Chicago, about how I probably knew more about street fighting than combat. It pissed me off, but I never said anything because he was my squad leader. Then he died saving my life, took the bullet that had my name on it, and I don't know how to feel about any of it." I stopped cutting and looked at him. "You can honor his sacrifice and still be angry about his prejudice," I said. "Dead doesn't make a man perfect, it just makes him dead." James's eyes met mine, and I saw the relief there. Relief that someone had finally given him permission to hold 2 truths at the same time: to grieve and be grateful and be angry all at once. That's what they don't teach you in the military. That people are complicated. That heroes can also be flawed. That the men who save your life might also be the ones who never quite saw you as equal. Morrison had died in Helmand, and I'd saved his squad, and I still didn't know if he'd ever respected me or just tolerated me. I'd carried that confusion for 15 years, and watching James grapple with the same complexity made me realize I wasn't alone in that particular burden. Titan had been with me for almost a year when Linda called again. "Marcus, we have another dog. Same situation. Military working dog. Too damaged for normal adoption. Scheduled for behavioral euthanasia." "I know it's a lot to ask, but—" I cut her off. "What's the dog's name?" There was a pause. "Her name is Shadow. Belgian Malinois. 3 deployments, lost her handler in Syria. She's been attacking everyone who comes near her." I looked at Titan, who was asleep in the corner of the workshop. His body finally relaxed enough to show his age, his graying muzzle resting on his paws. "Bring her down," I said. "We'll figure it out." Shadow arrived on a Tuesday, twice as aggressive as Titan had been, and it took 3 weeks before she'd even look at me without trying to bite through the fence. But Titan helped. His presence seemed to calm her in ways human interaction couldn't, as if she recognized in him the same wounds she carried. I watched them together, 2 war veterans learning to exist in a world that no longer required them to be weapons, and I thought about all the veterans I'd known who hadn't made it home. Not because they'd died in combat, but because they'd died inside and nobody had noticed until it was too late. The suicide rate among veterans is 22 per day. 22 soldiers who survived the war only to lose the battle with themselves. Titan and Shadow were alive because someone decided they deserved a chance to heal. How many veterans deserved the same chance and never got it? The workshop became a gathering place. Word spread through the veteran community that an old black NCO in Augusta was taking in broken war dogs and somehow putting them back together, and that if you showed up on a Saturday, you could help build furniture and nobody would ask you how you were doing or thank you for your service or any of the other useless things civilians said when they didn't know what else to say. Young veterans started showing up. Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force, men and women who'd served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, places whose names were classified. They'd work with wood, learn to use the tools, and spend time with Titan and Shadow, and the 3 other dogs I'd taken in by then. We didn't talk about the war much. Didn't need to. You can recognize the shape of trauma in someone else without needing to exchange war stories or compare scars. We just worked, created things from wood that had been broken down and rebuilt into something useful. And in the process, maybe we learned to see ourselves as something more than the damage we carried. The dogs taught us patience, taught us that healing happens on its own timeline, taught us that sometimes being present is enough even when you can't fix what's broken. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the workshop full of broken veterans and broken war dogs started to look less like a salvage yard and more like a sanctuary. The price of war isn't paid in the field. It's paid every morning you wake up at 300 with your heart hammering and your hands reaching for weapons that aren't there. It's paid in relationships that crumble because you can't explain why crowded restaurants make you scan for exits, why 4th of July fireworks send you diving for cover, why your partner's gentle touch sometimes feels like an attack. It's paid in the jobs you can't hold because authority figures trigger your rage, in the children you love but can't connect with because you've forgotten how to be vulnerable, in the decades of your life spent managing symptoms instead of living. Titan's price was isolation and fear. Mine was 30 years of proving myself over and over to people who'd already decided I didn't belong. But there's another price. The one we pay when we survive and then refuse to live. When we let the war win by making our entire existence about managing its aftermath. I'd paid that price for 3 years after retirement, barely leaving my house, convinced that the world outside was still hostile territory. Titan had paid it in that kennel, convinced that everyone who approached was a threat. The dogs I took in after him paid it in their own ways, each one carrying wounds that no one could see but everyone could feel. And the veterans who came to my workshop on Saturdays paid it every day they woke up and had to decide if getting out of bed was worth the effort. The war wants us to pay that price forever. Our job is to figure out how to stop paying it. Titan is 12 years old now, his muzzle almost entirely gray, his movements slower but still purposeful. He sleeps in my house most nights, in the corner of my bedroom where he can see both the door and the window, still on guard, but no longer in distress. Shadow has been with me for 3 years and has learned to play. Actual play. The kind that dogs are supposed to do, chasing sticks and rolling in the grass like the war never happened. The 3 other dogs are in various stages of healing, and the veterans keep coming, keep building things, keep learning that broken doesn't mean useless. I've rebuilt 43 pieces of furniture with their help, and every single one of them carries the story of its makers, veterans who learned that their hands could create instead of just destroy. Linda still calls occasionally, always with another dog that nobody else will take. I've learned to say no sometimes, learned that I can't save every broken thing that comes through the door, but I take the ones I can. The VA has started referring veterans to my workshop officially now, part of some pilot program for alternative therapy. I don't charge anything, don't want their money, don't need their official sanction. I just open the workshop on Saturdays and let whoever shows up decide what they want to build. Some days we build furniture. Some days we just sit with the dogs and let the silence do its work. Some days young veterans show up barely holding on, and we talk them through the crisis, give them the number for the suicide hotline, make them promise to come back next week. It's not professional therapy. It's just what veterans have always done. Take care of each other when nobody else knows how. The lesson I've learned, the one Titan taught me and Shadow reinforced and every broken dog and broken veteran I've met since has confirmed, is this. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean the wounds close up and disappear like they were never there. It means learning to carry the weight without letting it crush you. It means accepting that you're different now, changed by what you've survived, and that different doesn't mean broken. It means finding purpose in the aftermath, even if that purpose is just getting through one more day, building one more piece of furniture, taking in one more war dog that everyone else has given up on. The system failed Titan. It failed me too in smaller ways. The racism I faced, the assumptions about my competence, the constant need to prove I deserved the uniform I wore. The system fails a lot of veterans, sends them home with thank yous and parades, and then abandons them to fight battles without backup or support. But here's what I know after 62 years on this planet and 30 years in the Army. The system doesn't get to define what we become. We do. Titan could have died in that kennel, another casualty of a war that took his handler and his purpose. Instead, he's asleep on my porch right now, gray-muzzled and gentle, living proof that even the most damaged among us can learn to be at peace. I'm standing in my workshop as the sun sets over Georgia pine, wood shavings curling under my hands as I plane a piece of walnut that'll become a table for a young Marine who served in Syria. Titan's asleep in the doorway, Shadows lying in the yard watching the tree line for threats that don't exist anymore, and 3 other dogs are scattered around the property, each one carrying its own history of war and survival. The light coming through the workshop windows is golden and soft, painting everything in shades of amber that make the sawdust look like gold dust, like something precious salvaged from destruction. My hands ache, arthritis setting in after too many years carrying heavy packs and heavy memories, but the ache is good. It means I'm still here, still working, still creating. It means I survived. In the corner of the workshop, on a shelf above my workbench, sits a photograph of Rex from Desert Storm, a folded American flag from my retirement ceremony, and Titan's old military collar with his service number stamped into the leather. I don't worship these objects, don't treat them like sacred relics, but they remind me where I've been and what I've survived. They remind me that I was a soldier once, that I served honorably even when others doubted I could, that the color of my skin never diminished the quality of my service no matter how many people tried to pretend it did. And they remind me that I'm more than the sum of my wounds, more than my service record, more than the trauma I carry. I'm a carpenter now, a dog trainer, a keeper of broken things who's learning, slowly, to be less broken himself. If this story found you at the right time, let me know where you're listening from. Sometimes sharing these memories helps carry the weight a little easier. And if you're a veteran reading this, if you're struggling with the war that followed you home, if you're feeling like nobody understands what you're carrying, you're not alone. Find your workshop, whatever that means for you. Find your Titan. Find the work that makes your hands steady and your mind quiet. Find the purpose that comes after service. It won't fix everything. It won't make the war disappear. But it might be enough to keep you here, keep you building, keep you fighting for the peace you couldn't find on the battlefield. That's the mission now. That's the only mission that matters.